Thank you, Mayor and Council. My name's Julian Summers. I live on Vancouver's North Shore and was raised near the proposed redevelopment site. My remarks are based on my 35 years now of clinical practice and research addressing harm reduction and recovery from addiction and mental illness. There's been little mention of mental illness in these public hearings or the fact that recovery from mental illness is common and attainable with appropriate support. Evidence that unaddressed mental illness plays a central role in BC's crisis of homelessness, crime, addiction, and death is overwhelming. And I oppose the current proposal because the built form of the building is markedly at odds with that evidence. When the BC government closed Riverview Hospital, it committed to providing support for recovery closer to home. As Vancouver Police have detailed, those commitments remain lost in transition. In 2006, Canada's Kirby Commission called for an evidence-based vision, and I quote, "At the core of this vision is a recovery-oriented, primarily community-based, integrated continuum of care. That vision informs Portugal's successful national strategy, which states, I quote, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as treatment without social reintegration." Canada also implemented the world's largest scientific project addressing recovery among people deemed the hardest to house, and I was honored to lead that research in Vancouver. Our 500 study participants had been homeless for an average of 10 years and all experienced serious mental disorders. Their most common health-related goal was to overcome their addictions. 25% had children under age 18 that they were separated from. 25% had been in foster care, and over 80% wanted to resume paid work the day we met them. Using comprehensive provincial data, we learned that only 17% of our clients were living in the Vancouver region when they became homeless. That's Metro. They migrated from communities with few resources, and each year they spent more days in hospital, in custody, and needed additional income assistance. We randomly assigned participants to 3 groups. One group received choices of dispersed, affordable housing with 24/7 support. A second group received residences in a single building, like what is being proposed, with 24/7 support on site. A third group received usual care, meaning standard services in the community at large. Our results showed that in contrast with usual care, where most people remained homeless, both congregate housing and dispersed affordable housing created market housing stability. However, those living in dispersed housing also experienced a 71% reduction in crime, a 50% reduction in medical emergencies, and significant and meaningful improvements in continuity of health care. In congregate housing, levels of crime and medical emergencies were not significantly different from those who remained homeless in usual care. The culture of their building was comparatively homogeneous, with limited opportunities for social mobility. There's nothing inherently wrong with congregate housing. Every successful apartment building confirms the value of congregate housing. What matters is the mix of tenants or residents. Imagine 2 buildings, one with a cross-section of society living in affordable housing, the other with people living at the shelter rate and all having experienced homelessness, mental illness, and addiction. Which building would you choose to live in? And if you chose affordable, socially diverse housing, why should we expect people who experience mental illness to choose differently? Internationally, 84% of people experiencing homelessness and mental illness prefer independent housing. By approving single-room congregate housing for people who are among the hardest to house, Council would expose residents to excess medical emergencies and preventable involvement in crime. By endorsing that the shelter rate should in any way define the standard of housing available to people with serious mental illness, Council would be practicing stigma, while restricting opportunities for reunion with children and social integration more broadly. Given the highly engaged KITS community, there is an opportunity to secure a small percentage of affordable units on the proposed site for people exiting prolonged homelessness and extend the same approach to other new and existing buildings in the neighborhood. I encourage Council to embrace the Kirby Commission's vision of community-based recovery by supporting practices that align with evidence and with the values of community members who want to be part of the solution, while inspiring other BC communities to do the same, recognizing that any solution must be provincial. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time. Just checking here. Councillor Hardwick, you have up to 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Summers. There's two issues that we've been focused on. One is the physical built form in height and massing density has been discovered, and the other is the composition of residents. Do you see a correlation between the two? Would it matter if it was a 6-story building with this composition of residents? Does the height and massing have have anything to do or reinforce the composition of residents?
Well, I agree with an earlier speaker who characterized or may have been a councillor recalling a speaker, characterizing the built form as prison-like or institutional, small windows, double entry, a courtyard manufactured on the interior, as though the intent was to prevent people from interacting with other neighborhood members and having access to outside within a confined space. It's not a built form that is at all conducive to social reintegration for people who have been homeless for long periods of time. And most people who've been homeless for long periods of time also experience mental illness. That's what differentiates long-term homelessness from the many other people who exit homelessness more quickly and through their resources. So the built form, it seems like it could work for very select groups of people, but not people who've exited homelessness. It's more like student housing, housing for people who are here on a short stay, flight crews, that sort of thing. When we did our research, no other city in the country thought it made sense to implement a congregate building because none of them thought that there was value. They thought the results were already in. It's why we deinstitutionalized. That
Right.
compelling people to live together is antithetical to their prospects for recovery, and its diversity and proximity to loved ones and community membership and fellowship that are the major components, as they are for most of us.
So paraphrasing, if social reintegration is our objective, this is not the form physically that it should take.
Agreed.
Okay, there have been a couple of speakers that have been suggesting that your research is flawed and that there are other individuals with whom you have done your research that are contradicting the position that you've taken forward. Would you like to address that?
Boy, would I, thanks. So there are two, right? There are two that I know of, and out of, like a lot of people that I've worked with over the years. And neither of them got in touch with me first, so I wish they had, because we probably could have addressed what I believe are misunderstandings. The Dr. Palapu is attributed saying that results favor congregate and congregate works as well, and referencing a 2017 paper that I'm the lead author on. So we publish papers on discrete facets of large projects like this in separate studies. That particular study reported one of our main outcomes of interest was just housing stability. And indeed, I'll confirm that there was no significant difference in the overall rate of housing stability among people who received congregate versus the option of scattered housing. All of the other outcomes in that manuscript are based on questionnaires that were adapted from other research that didn't involve homeless people. And the results were extraordinarily perplexing. Namely, everybody's scores went up and about the same. there are only two measures where there is any significant difference. They do happen to favor the congregate group, but the perplexing part is that on questionnaire measures, 10-item questionnaires, assessing things like overall wellness, psychiatric symptoms, community integration, the people who were randomly assigned to usual care and who we know remained homeless improved as much as the people who received market housing and support and the people in congregate. Everybody's scores went up. That was true across the country in all 5 sites. Boy, were we disappointed.
Thank you. That is, we're past the 5 minutes,
Okay.
so I'm going to go on to Councillor Weeb. Councillor Weeb, please go ahead.
Yeah, first question, you talked about the building built form doesn't work for social integration. Can you talk about what changes to the built form you'd like to see?
Well, I was here for the earlier presentation of a 6-story rendering, and I'll lend support to that, although it's the first time that I had seen it. But the reasons I'll lend support to it are that, number one, it reflects the sentiments of people who live in the neighborhood, which I don't any longer. And it refers to the goal of establishing additional housing that is consistent with the fabric of existing housing and is designed to welcome people who would be exiting homelessness and in need of housing, but along with others who would further complement the social milieu that's established in kits, which provides the people who are exiting homelessness with the greatest opportunity to feel welcome and to feel not singled out, to feel as though they're truly a part of things. And if that approach is followed, I can't comment on the specific form that was proposed because it was a sketch, but if that overall ethos was pursued, it would lead to a form that is more conducive to people choosing homes and feeling valued and welcomed as community members, and that ought to be, if we're going to make good on what we said in the 70s, deinstitutionalizing, that ought to be applied to many, many other buildings where people have the opportunity to join as neighbors. And as we showed in our trial, there was no NIMBY backlash. There were no concerns raised in the scattered site housing. Lots of naysayers telling us that you're not going to get landlords to rent to you, bad things will happen. None of that came true. And people experienced the most profound thing was not what they got from our team. It was telling us that after a year, 2 years, they felt as though they belonged. They felt as though they were welcome and that they were being treated as normal people. Imagine that. So where people have the opportunity to experience that, I'm for it. Putting them in a building that advertises special needs inside, such as the renderings that I've seen of the proposed building, are simply frightening and are essentially displaying people in a way that is stigmatizing. So I think you've seen enough already in the presentations to, I hope, get the gist of what I'm referring to and why the 6-story building was presented with the elements that were described.
Okay, second follow-up question. You talked about having a different and more diverse mix of people in the building creates healthier outcomes. Can you talk from your research what type of mix you think would be to create a best outcome in a building of this size?
Well, social engineering is a dangerous sport. What we found best and is what we would, I think most of us apply to ourselves and to others that we care about in our lives. We provided people with choices. And why did they choose that building next to the park with oak trees or next to the corner store that reminded them of something that they had access to when they were children? What's important is the opportunity to present people with decent, dispersed, affordable housing options and providing them with the dignity to choose. And they will make choices that in some ways resonate with them in the same ways that the rest of us do.
Okay, thanks for coming to speak today.
Thank you. Councillor Dominato's next, up to 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks for coming in today. A couple of quick questions just off the start. You talked about congregate housing. I'm over here. We don't have formally that definition to the city in terms of our housing stream, and we've talked about this as these are studio units. They're not the same as it's been represented as SROs, and they're not in that context of you have. So when you talk about, can you expand on your view of what congregate housing is, because we don't have a definition in the city bylaws.
Sure. The term is used in literature along these lines of supporting recovery and helping people who've been homeless for many years to have a chance at recovery, is used not specifically in relation to bachelor, SRO, or other sizes or configurations of units. It is more a reference to the social diversity in the building. And when individuals who, as is done in some research, including ours, when people are housed all together in the same building, that is what we refer to as congregate, a congregate approach, as opposed to this dispersed choice-based approach. Those are the two comparators that have been most researched. So it doesn't have to do with size of units. It's the social mix in the building.
Okay, and so in that context, then whether it's 50 studio units or 120, it's still congregate.
That's right. That's right. You can think of it as also as concentrating people who all are coming from similar histories and similar types of social disadvantages. Right. The foster care, the level of adverse childhood experiences that typically goes back to childhood. Now, there is a middle ground. People who've been homeless, have less severe needs, and who may choose and do well in housing where they are supported alongside other people with comparable needs. Now, we did that research also in a randomized trial, and where people who need supports on an occasional basis, so not a 24/7 team, but somebody who might help them broker access to care, are likely to do better when they're supported alongside other people with comparable needs. But the more severe and more complex their challenges are, the more strongly indicated it is that they have a choice and the opportunity to experience social surroundings that are normalizing and healthier.
Okay, super helpful. I have one more question. Councillor Weeb asked a couple of questions I wanted to ask, but I want to just drill down on an example, and if you're not familiar with it, that's okay. You talked to Councillor Weeb asked about the type of mix. The Kettle on Burrard has been operating for a number of years. It was opened after Marguerite Ford, and there was a lot of lessons learned from that. And they started using the vulnerability assessment tool to make sure that there was a mix of tenants within that building. So individuals who may have higher needs, others who may need less needs and supports. Can you comment on that in terms of, is that tool still being utilized by BC Housing or within this sector? I don't know if that's come up in your research, but that was my experience there, is that there was a lot of lessons learned from Marguerite Ford. So there was a move to diversify the tenanting based on this use of this tool, but I don't know if that's still being used.
I don't know what BC Housing is doing. There's no tool like the vulnerability assessment tool that would play a prominent role in understanding the needs of the group of people that I'm referring to. They require a thorough clinical assessment, neuropsychological assessment, proper diagnostics. They require a thorough physical history and exam as well. And so it's not a matter of a straightforward tool. And the fact that we don't provide these kinds of assessments to assist people is part of what perpetuates this category we refer to as hardest to house. There is a group typically struggling with serious mental illnesses. The longer they remain homeless and at risk, the more likely they are to experience poisonings, cognitive damage, mortality. And that only further complicates or increases, I guess, the need for thorough and careful clinical assessment as well as social and forward-looking assessments. What are their interests? What are the long-term prospects that are most likely to be a part of their recovery? So there's no simple tool that cuts through all of that.
No, I
Thank you.
appreciate that. Thank you, and I'm at my time.
Councillor Boyle, up to 5.
Thanks. I have a number of questions, but actually something you answered to Councillor Dominato sparked an additional question for me. So I'll start there, which is you described congregate housing as social mix, and I'm curious to hear if a building of all high-end, high-cost housing that also lacked a social mix by a kind of income definition that we've heard would also qualify as congregate housing?
You mean if it was homogeneous, but everyone in the building is a rich person?
Yeah, if everyone in the building, if it's high cost, so you have to have a certain income to live there.
I haven't had an opportunity to do research on exclusively rich people in buildings and how they fare. So a term like congregate hasn't been used in that context. It is used in the context that I described earlier of what difference does it make if people with particularly severe needs, again, those who have been least well served by existing resources, are placed in buildings altogether, so congregated, versus provided with opportunities to choose where they would live, in which case they will, all of the people we gave choices to chose to leave the neighborhood where we met them, and they did not choose to be in buildings that had other, that they knew had other individuals in them who also had exited homelessness. They chose immediately, as happens in other places where this choice is given, they chose places where they felt that they could have a chance at establishing themselves. And
Okay, I'm sorry to cut you off. I have a few questions, so I
sure,
just want to make sure
sorry.
I get through them. This particular building has already been changed to be only 50% units at shelter rate. So I'm interested to hear, that seems to me to increase the social mix as you speak about it. Does that seem like a better situation by that definition?
No, it doesn't. When we closed Riverview and promised people with serious mental illness who lacked support that they would be provided with services closer to home, I worked at Riverview. This was in the 1980s. No one said to me or anyone else, we're going to provide you with resources closer to home as long as the housing is at the shelter rate, because that would have been crazy. How much we didn't budget our hospital beds around the shelter rate. Right? And the reason that this scattered approach to housing is cost effective is because we spend so much while people are homeless on each day in hospital, each day in custody. So no, anything anchored to the shelter rate, as I said, is stigmatizing. Why we wouldn't provide housing to people with cancer only at the shelter rate, right? Why are we doing that for people with mental illness? How did we even get into that trap? We need to
Okay.
support people in ways that promote their recovery. That costs more than BC's shelter rate.
Again, sorry to interrupt. I'm curious to hear if you think congregate housing is better or worse than the status quo.
What's the status quo?
Well, I'm not allowed to answer your questions, but I'll reframe it to say the status quo is we see people living in tents in parks, people living in tents on Hastings Street, and we don't have a proposal in front of us for scattered housing. We have a proposal in front of us for the building as you see, and we've been discussing. So I guess I'm interested in is this building better or worse than people in tents and people on the street?
Well, I don't want to answer that for other people. But it would be a huge step in the wrong direction, because you would be affirming that let's recall what I said, 17%, 17 of the people who we met in Vancouver who had been homeless here and were deemed the hardest to house, 17 were in Metro when they became homeless. They came from far afield, and building something like this is essentially further declaring that the only place in BC where you're going to get help are big buildings in Kits and other places like that. Because nothing like this is
Okay.
happening
I'm
elsewhere.
running out of time. I think we could debate that particular point for much longer, but the
You're
mayor
actually
would
out of
put me
time.
up, so I will
Thank
leave
you.
it there.
I'm going to go to Councillor Kirby Young, up to 5 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Summers. I'm over here on your right. Thanks for coming to speak to council. I appreciate it. I think you were very clear, and I appreciated the clarification with respects to congregate housing being about the diversity of housing. And I guess my question is this, is that we're seeing increasing prevalence of mental illness. So beyond the housing, if we subscribe to that philosophy that you're describing in terms of a mix, I'm really interested if you see, and keeping it related to this application, a need to pivot in terms of just providing the housing, because it seems to be housing without the service, and or how do you provide that those needed supports for mental wellness that we're increasingly seeing are becoming more prevalent, even with a mix.
So how do we provide the supports that are needed? Yeah, SFU and at least a dozen, maybe 14 not-for-profit societies spent about 8 months developing a proposal that's a call to action. It was featured in one of the slides earlier today. It's online, and it describes the process of preparing teams to deliver exactly the same quality of support that was provided in our randomized trial. So exactly the same intervention. And there is no place that is currently doing it. BC Housing is actually opposed to it, as is the provincial government when I've presented this.
Why is that?
I don't know. I don't know, but strongly opposed. Strongly opposed.
Okay, because regardless of the mix, and I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm hearing, and I think it sounds like you're agreeing, is my question, with respect to the fact that we also have this gap in terms of how we deliver
we do, but
so to me, this
it's
isn't just about housing, this is about housing and.
Yes, this gap is completely feasible to address. The fact that we've addressed it previously with multiple teams that we've trained in our research to the same standard.
What does a team look like conceptually? Can you sketch that out for council?
Yeah, so 8 to 10 people, mix of medical, social, and vocational rehabilitative skills. Everybody facile in mental illness, psychopathology, and the process of recovery. People working actively in specific roles, landlord relations or housing portfolio management, ensuring that people are a good fit with the building that they've first chosen. Vocational experts who are working with employers, preparing individuals to enter the workforce. I mentioned 80% plus want paid work, and over 60, about 2/3 had completed paid work for at least 1 year before they became homeless. So they had it in their history as well as in their aspirations. So the vocational piece and the housing portfolio management piece are central and stand alone. Most of the others are relating to various specialty areas in health and social well-being, including mental illness expertise of different kinds, addiction-related expertise, harm reduction, recovery-oriented skills.
Okay.
So that rounds out the team.
Okay, I just have about a minute and a half left, and I'm wondering, and you can answer this if you feel comfortable or not, but what if you composite? Do you think the reluctance is because of cost? Do you think the reluctance is because it's a model that we don't have today? And sort of related, corollary to that is, has there been any analysis that it is more expensive not to provide something like those team support in terms of hospital visits, emergencies?
3 times.
Response?
3 times. We did it in 2006 for the entire province, $55,000 a year per person. It costs while people are homeless in BC. I thought that would move the needle. The 2 other teams have led research on the same topic in BC using different methods, and thank goodness for me, they come in around the same figure, about $50,000, $55,000 in easily countable public costs, not inferring costs like costs of crime or things like that, but days in hospital, days in custody, those kinds of things. And yes, there are people that we are seeing in our communities for whom it costs substantially less to intervene immediately and provide them with what I've described than it does to leave them on the street for another year.
Right. Okay, that's very informative. Thank you. Appreciate you speaking.
Yep. Councillor Carr?
Yeah, a couple of questions. Appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. My first one, I was very interested in what you were saying about Riverview, and I remember the closing of the psychiatric hospital, and I remember specifically that the provincial government had promised $23 million to families in communities throughout BC to take home one of their family members who were there, and that they never delivered, not one penny of that amount of money. So the question around that, and those people, many, because I have conversations all through BC, ended up coming to the downtown east side. So my question is really around providing the resources at the community level, and making sure that people have the supports they need. Is that a fundamental part of what you're talking about?
Yeah, it is, absolutely is. It is not in the main skill set of, it's not an area of strength in any of our existing major structures, not BC Housing, not health authorities, and they're busy doing other things. I don't mean to imply criticism that they're not also experts at this, but none of the existing structures are themselves the experts. It is, in fact, the not-for-profit societies who have the most insight in how best to help people, but they are a completely segregated system of entities with no common standards, no common training, and also without common budgets. They're competing against each other. There's, as you can expect in some instances, where those pressures lead. So part of our call to action was to create communities of practice that all would be trained to the same standard, would adhere to the same standard, would enable some of those people, Councillor Carr, that moved to the downtown east side, maybe accessed supports here, but wanted to relocate to Quesnel. But also importantly, be assured that they were going to be supported in the same way, right? Right now, that's not possible. But through not, it's not a, it's different, and I think that's where it fell down. That's the reason for its torpedoing. But it is not at all an insoluble task to prepare 6 not-for-profit societies or teams in 6 not-for-profit societies over 2 years to deliver the same standard of care and to support one another in that endeavor.
Right. Okay. It's a lot of paths down to solutions, aren't there? I'm very interested in what you have to say around the mix of people. That seems to be a big theme of what you're talking about. When staff introduced the last night of our public hearings, they answered a lot of questions that we had posed to them as councillors. And regarding, and some of those had to do with the mix of people. And staff answered this way, and I'm interested in your response to this. They said, look, the first priority is housing people who are homeless from the neighborhood. Then they said, this proposal would include a mix of people, people who have disabilities, mental health issues, drug addiction issues, people who just don't have enough income, and that's why they're homeless. So is that getting at the right mix of people? When I say right, a mix of people that you think would work?
I don't really know what that is meant to bring to mind. Are we talking about people who experience schizophrenia or other psychotic illnesses? Is that what we're talking about? Somebody with bipolar disorder and methamphetamine addiction? Is that what we're talking about?
They didn't get into that specific, but they mentioned people who may have addiction issues, who may have, including drugs and alcohol, people who have mental health issues, people with physical disabilities, people who just don't have enough money. That is the mix that they describe for us.
That doesn't sound like a mix. That sounds like a backhanded way of saying people who we don't want to have in our other buildings.
I don't understand.
It sounds like people who we have systematically excluded. We're going to put them all in one place.
I think it was getting at the question that was posed by speakers who said it's going to all be people who have mental illness or who have drug addiction problems. So I think it was getting
Oh,
at that.
so it's not only that, it's also people with physical disabilities.
And people who just don't have enough money.
Right. And how many of them would choose to live in that building
We're at the
versus
5 minute.
versus an alternative?
Councillor Fry, you're up next.
Thanks. So I understand some from Dr. Anita Palepu, head of medicine at UBC, who you referenced earlier. She commented variously about vulnerable populations not being homeless and vulnerable populations not being heterogeneous, and so by that extension, I'm assuming that your sort of critique of congregate housing wouldn't be would be heterogeneous in the sense that there may be some scenarios that work better than others. And I'm wondering if you could kind of allude to what you might think would be a better context for congregate housing if we're looking at sort of the metrics of success that you've established here.
Yeah. So as I said, any well-functioning apartment building attests to the value of people living together. So diversity is one thing. In sort of my area, there are addiction. There are a number of models that use cohabitation, people living together. So we have, for example, therapeutic communities. We also have recovery homes. We have problems with linked to that particular descriptor here in BC at the moment, but that is an approach that can serve people very well. For people with stimulant addictions, residential contingency management, which involves housing people together, is the treatment of choice. So there are. There's my former research team at the University of Washington has worked closely with a managed alcohol program, and this is where typically older men are housed together and provided with alcohol in their homes. So there are examples of housing where people with specific challenges reside together either as part of a continuing program like managed alcohol, but most of them, therapeutic communities, recovery homes, are time limited. Now that time can be months to years, but they're time limited, and they beg the question, what next? And what comes next would best be entry into the community. So yeah, people who experience homelessness are widely heterogeneous. Some are there purely because of money. The ones who get stuck, though, have other challenges.
Yeah, certainly. I speak to a lot of folks experiencing homelessness, and I know that there's a wide variety. So curious then, if your research has kind of uncovered any successes as of moving housing, congregate style housing or supportive housing or what have you outside of the downtown east side, if you've kind of extrapolated any benefits to for tenants if they're not at the downtown east side, for instance.
Not around here. I mean, not so specifically not in Vancouver, but actually not in Canada. Here the examples tend to illustrate the opposite because the attempt has been made to cluster people who have very high needs together with woefully inadequate supports and no vision of recovery whatsoever. So they have been horrible disservices to the people themselves, chiefly. So no, I'm not aware of examples that illustrate success for those, again, for those who are deemed the hardest to house, people who have serious mental illnesses, often with addictions as well, and who've been homeless for many years. Those that are supporting people are supporting individuals with less complex needs.
Okay, just with my last 30 seconds here, recognizing that there's not, that, the province is paying for this and this is their model that they're putting forward. and the option for like scattered sites isn't really on the table. What would you say to that?
Put it on the table.
Tell the province to put it on the table and walk away from this?
Yeah, get council, put it on the table. About time.
Okay, well, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Councillor Swanson.
Yeah. So I used to volunteer at the Carnegie Center. I think I met you down there. And lots of times folks would come to me and they'd say, Jean, can you get me a place in this new modular housing that's being built? Not the place that we're discussing now, but other ones that were built before. And I basically, I couldn't. They were people who were homeless or people who lived in SROs. But some of them did manage to get in. And then I'd see them and I'd say, well, how do you like your new housing? And they would say, this happened to maybe 6 or 8 people. They all had the same phrase for how they liked their new housing, which was, I feel like I won the lottery. And this is the same type of what you call congregate housing. So, like, what you're saying is contradicting my experience. Can you explain why?
I'll try. I think one key was provided in your description. They chose it. They came to you and said, "I want that."
Okay, I get that. I get the choosing. Is there any evidence that the people who would move into this building would not choose it, that someone would force them to move into it?
People will make desperate decisions when the alternatives are so dire as fear of losing one's life, which is as you know, and I've heard now increasingly. Also, I'm sure you've heard the same thing, that people who are living rough now, or people who were living rough and who have moved inside in the last few years and who occasionally go out into the streets, will say, I don't think I would make it. And if I'm out there through the next winter, I'm not gonna see the other side. So
Yeah.
people in those circumstances, this is part of that crucible of increasing desperation that is causing people to take their own lives. More than half of those who experience non-fatal poisonings experience suicidal ideation at the time of taking the drugs. There are also violent acts towards other people that are not caused by people's mental illness or by their character, but by the prolonged suffering of the circumstances that they live in. So people will make choices. I'm perplexed that it's not a win to say that, well, you said 84%, so does that mean 16% or some fraction of that might choose congregate housing? Yeah, it does. And my question is, why in the world are you building for that minority when there is such a gaping need and opportunity to help the much larger number?
So what about people that just want housing, that don't necessarily want treatment? They might want a few supports, but they don't want a big medicalized thing.
Yeah, provide them with affordable housing. I mentioned that that the primary health-related goal among people in our experience is overcoming addiction. When we randomized people to the Bosman Hotel, our congregate arm, the main reason people moved in and said, "Can you please get me out of here?" which we did, was if I go in here, that's going to trigger my addiction. So now we're talking about a building with a consumption site, and you're going to propose, and that's where people are going to be supported toward recovery. It seems incongruous.
So, are you saying that people have to be pushing themselves towards your definition of recovery, and B, that people who don't have mental health or addiction and who don't use drugs shouldn't be living with people who do?
Well, let me emphasize, this is not my definition of recovery. I think that your very assertion reflects a misunderstanding or perhaps a lack of understanding of what the term recovery means in the mental health and addiction field. It is an individual defined construct. We know a great deal about the components that go into it, but it is never something that a clinician or somebody outside the individual asserts or offers a definition of as something to aim for. The experience is animated by substantial, qualitatively different experiences of agency and self-control, of opportunity, of optimism for the future, of connections, and
Okay,
of also of reduced symptoms. But it is
Thank you.
not something that people like me foist onto people.
Okay, we're over the 5 minutes. I put myself on the list for questions. So I'm familiar at the intersection with politics and academia, and I'm going to pull you over to the politics side here.
Mayor, it's Councilor Kirby. Would you like me to take over so you can ask questions?
Nope,
I know
I'm
you.
going to Kara's our last ask questions until the motion's moved.
Okay, thank you.
So the decision in front of us tonight is this. We're a quasi-judicial body. In this, we have very strict guidelines on what we can not only decide upon and what we can discuss. And our options are thus. We can approve this project as it is, the rezoning, the height and form. We can send it back to staff for a redo, or we can say no. If we do anything other than approve it, we lose the funding. And so we don't get a maybe in this case. It's a yes or no. And I'm just wondering, if you were in our situation, which would you pick?
I'd send it back for rezoning. I might say no, though, out of outrage that the province is holding vulnerable people and you hostage when there is no. That is you know, I'd been working with Minister Eby on justice related things when he got his new mandate letter, and when I first offered to provide support and he took me up on it, I approached the whole enterprise with optimism and in good faith, and I learned that he was not at all doing the same, not at all. And
well, I won't go down that road. I just have to click a button in the next couple of days, either yes or no, and I'm just wondering which button you'd click.
Listen. I'm listening actively to the discussion, and I mean, thank you for asking. I would send it back to staff, and the reason being
that kills it. We lose the funding then. You don't get that option. It's either take the building as it is, or lose the funding.
Well, I thought you said there were three options: send it back to staff or say no.
No. If we send it back to staff, we lose the funding. That's what we've been told.
Well then I would send it back to staff and let the province explain. Let Minister Eby explain why this public hearing process that has elicited such a powerful outpouring of ideas, of shared sentiments by a great many people, and an interest in dialogue with council that has moved toward what appears, based on today's presentation, to be a viable end goal that could set a precedent not only for Vancouver, but usefully for the rest of the province. Why, after having achieved that progress, would the province say, forget about it? It's all worthless. That would simply be wrong-headed, cruel, and wasteful, and perhaps just further emphasize why a change in leadership is needed.
Okay, so that's a no. Okay, thanks. We'll go over to Councillor Kirby. Thanks for your time. Councillor Kirby, go ahead. Oh, I think you have just 10 seconds left. No? Councillor Kirby?
I'm sorry, Mayor, I couldn't hear. Could you please repeat?
Oh, you just had yourself on the list, but you had 10 seconds left.
No, that must have been a holdover.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, thanks. That's it for questions. Thank you,